Shalom, Talmidim, v'Talmidot. Hello, students. This is Dr. Everson. Feels weird calling you students. Many of you are maybe around my age. If you're as old as I am, I'm the ripe old age of 43. But anyway, you like me. You're a lifelong learner, and here we are talking about the book of Ruth. I'm going to share some things with you about this wonderful book of the Bible. The book of Ruth is very poignant. It's very well written. It's written with great thought and craftsmanship. It's a great book, and there you see an image of Ruth as she's holding the gleanings that she has harvested from the fields of Boaz. Anyway, we'll just walk through this book together and look at its structure and talk about some of its theology. The book begins with the plight of Naomi. Naomi is from Bethlehem. Her husband, and her sons moved to Moab because of famine. This was a thing in the ancient world. It's sometimes a thing in the modern world. Let me just say something about economics. Really, as I see it, humans, for most of our history, have lived in what we would consider crushing poverty. We have lived hand to mouth. That is, we've had a subsistence way of living where there hasn't been tremendous wealth and resources. I mean, today, of course, resources are scarce, right? People don't give money away. But we live in a world of abundant resources comparatively, and this has to do with the Industrial Revolution. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, humans lived in poverty. In the ancient world, this is certainly true. And in the medieval world, and even in the early modern world, humans lived in poverty. I heard one historical economist or economical historian, I'm not sure which title would be more correct, talking about medieval Europe. And in medieval Europe, it was common for folks to own 3 or so outfits in a lifetime, right? They made shoes out of wood because that's how poor they were. Anyway, in the ancient world, long story short, in the ancient world, people did live in tremendous poverty, and surviving was a very scary thing. And of course, family became very important to this end. I look at the family in the ancient world as sort of a unit of survival, right? Today, in the modern world, we look at the family as a system maybe of encouragement or support emotionally and financially, but if your family abandons you, you're not facing certain death. In the ancient world, if you lost your family, starvation became a very real prospect. And so this is how the story starts for Naomi, which would be terrifying for people in that day and age. And so hopefully that is something that that you feel as well when you read the text, that the life became very scary for Naomi. She travels, because of famine, she travels to Moab with her husband and her sons, so they can live there. They're there for 10 years or so, and her sons marry Moabite wives, as people often do. They marry people from nearby, usually, and her husband dies and her sons die, and so she's left bereft of children. She's left widowed from her husband, which of course you can only imagine the type of sorrow that would come along with that, the heartache, the despair, depression. And in the moment of tremendous vulnerability, she has both of her daughters-in-law offer to stay with her, and she says, no, please don't. One of them, Orpah, doesn't, but Ruth, the Moabitess, does, stays with her. And of course, this becomes a remarkable act of compassion and generosity on the part of Ruth, that at her lowest moment, she would be there for Naomi in this very powerful way. So that's how the book starts, in this very touching way. So yeah, so they leave. The Exodus is leaving Israel for. Sorry, the Exodus is leaving Moab to return to Bethlehem, and Ruth accompanies her back to Naomi's hometown, as it were. Uh, and then Boaz sort of comes onto the scene. Uh, Boaz was someone who was a relative of Naomi, and Ruth goes to glean in the fields of Boaz. And if you look in the book of Leviticus, they have laws about leaving the corners or the payot, the sides of the field for those who are poor. And of course, glean means you walk in these areas and you harvest grain, right? You harvest wheat kernels. If it's, a field of wheat, you harvest wheat kernels for yourself. And of course, it's not a way of getting rich, but it is a way of surviving. And of course, Boaz sees Ruth as she's there gleaning, and he inquires as to her identity. Ruth also has a conversation with Naomi about Boaz. And when Naomi hears that it's Boaz, there's sort of a light bulb that goes off above her head, and she becomes excited because Boaz is a relative and would be a candidate for a redeemer, or a goel, as they say in Hebrew, gimel aleph lamed, for those of you who do Hebrew, a goel. And redeem is an interesting word. If you look at the semantic range of its meanings, certainly one who delivers or one who restores would be included. And so Ruth and Naomi are in a vulnerable position within their society, and it would be incumbent upon their family to deliver or to restore them from their precarious situation, to be a savior of sorts. And so Boaz would be somebody who would be a candidate for that. And so Naomi is delighted to learn that Ruth has been in the fields of Boaz and has had some contact with him. Now, Boaz is not the closest relative or the first candidate for this role of redeemer, or kinsman redeemer, as some people call it. But he is a candidate, and Naomi's encouraged by this. And then next we have Naomi's plan to acquire Boaz as a kinsman redeemer for her and Ruth. Incidentally, I should point out that Naomi includes Ruth and her family in this. When she says, "Oh, that's Boaz. He is a redeemer of our family," she says our family, right? And she includes Ruth in that. So, though there's nothing linking them together anymore with the death of her son, Naomi does consider Ruth part of her family, and that's important. Okay, so the plan. So in the chapter 3, it begins with Naomi instructing Ruth what she should do as they move towards acquiring Boaz as a redeemer for their situation. And in verse 3, chapter 3, she says, "Wash therefore and make yourself known to the man." Wash therefore and anoint yourself and put on your cloak and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. And Ruth does this, and then skipping down to verse 8, at midnight, the man Boaz was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. And he said, "Who are you?" And she said, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, and that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich." So the threshing floor was where they would separate the wheat from the chaff. And of course, these are agricultural metaphors that some of us aren't really familiar with anymore, but wheat is a grass, and this is where civilization starts, right? Wheat is the staff of life, and civilization starts in the ancient Near East because of the domestication of wheat. And this is what they're doing here in Bethlehem, as people would do throughout the ancient Near East. They're growing wheat. And wheat is a grass, and when it grows fully, it sprouts kernels on the end of it, and those are edible. If you grind them, you can make flour, which you turn into bread. And the way you separate the wheat from the chaff, or the wheat from the grass, is that you strike it, you thresh it, and you do this on a flat surface, which they would call a threshing floor. And so you would strike it with a staff or a pitchfork or whatever, and it would separate. But then you have to separate the wheat from the chaff. And so what they would do is they would throw it all up in the air, and the kernels were dense and heavy, and they would, when they would go up in the air, they would fall back down where they started. But the wind would carry the light and less dense grass away. And so by throwing all of these things up into the air, the wheat and the chaff would be separated, and that was the threshing floor. And so this is where they would bring their harvest, and this is where he was sleeping. And Ruth, by approaching him this way and uncovering his feet and lying there in the middle of the night, sort of puts herself out there as somebody who is interested in him. And when he awakes, she identifies him as a redeemer, and he admires Ruth, and he responds. And so it was a bold move on the part of Naomi and Ruth to act in this way, and their plan succeeded. However, moving on to the public pronouncement section here, Boaz was not sort of first in line, right? In order to become her redeemer, he needs to sort of make sure, verify that the guy who would precede him in this, the candidate sort of with legal priority, is out of the way. And so this happens. So as you move on into the next chapter, he makes sure this guy's out of the way, and then he becomes her redeemer. And then you have a postlude, right, where it describes Ruth and Boaz becoming married, and also it provides sort of the subsequent genealogy of Ruth. Of course, Ruth then becomes sort of a matriarch of David, right? David descends from her line. And so just looking at the end here, then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. So then Ruth is a grandmother of David. Of course, when you look in the New Testament, Ruth is, this connection with David is given. And of course, she then is in the lineage of Jesus as well, in the genealogy of Matthew. So anyway, that's sort of the story of Ruth as it unfolds. I won't say much about its style. If this is something you're interested in, there is a great amount of detail that is worked into the style and structure of Ruth. It very clearly has a symmetrical design to it, where you have corresponding events that parallel each other as you move through the story. So it's written with great symmetry and care. And this is often how people would tell stories in the ancient world. And so it's very thoughtfully crafted and wonderfully written. Some people would describe its genre as a novella, which would be a brief narrative of conscious craftsmanship. But anyway, it's written with great style. And you get that even when you read it in English. If Hebrew is something that you're interested in, the Hebrew of Ruth is very readable. Some people start with Ruth, like if you learn Greek, you might start with the Gospel according to John. if you learn Hebrew, you might start with the book of Ruth. It's very readable, and of course it's fun to read too. And then theology, I would just talk about the mystery of providence. Clearly this book pertains to the Israelites as God's people, and God is mentioned often in the book of Ruth, right? Your land, your people will be my people, your God will be my God, is what Ruth says. And God is at work in the book. However, it's not, God's actions are not explicitly described. And what it reminds me of would be the Joseph narrative, right? Joseph, in the story of Genesis, goes through all sorts of difficulties and trials. Of course, Ruth and Naomi go through difficulties and trials as well. And God is at work in all of these things, but where exactly, it's not spelled out. And as I see it, it's one of these things where God is at work in all aspects. And this sort of rings true, to my own experience and perhaps your own experience as well, where you come to believe that God is at work in all things. And so, in a way, God is sort of everywhere. But because he's at work in all things, he's also sort of mysteriously hidden. And so there becomes this wonderful, mysterious quality to the work of God. And in the Joseph narrative, Joseph says to his brothers, you intended this for evil, but God intended it for good. And I think that is what we see in the book of Ruth too, that God is at work behind the scenes. And it rings true to life and rings true to our own experience, because this is often what happens, right? In moments of reflection or thought, you look back on your life, and hindsight is 20/20, and you can sort of see or guess where God has been at work. And sometimes it's very clear, and you have great confidence where God has been at work. Other times it's less clear. And this is sort of how I see the book of Ruth, where we have sort of the mystery of providence, God providing, God seeing to the care of Ruth and Naomi, but it's not explicitly stated exactly how it all happened. So anyway, for what that's worth, that's the book of Ruth, and we'll have another video also here looking at sort of the debate over what exactly happened at that threshing floor with Ruth and Boaz. Okay, I hope you're all having a great day. We'll talk to you later.